thank you so much for joining us. And you are a shale expert. So talk about this space, where it has been, where is it going, what do you see?
Great. Well, Julia, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be back at the conference. When you step back and think about shale, certainly I think it's one of the greatest North American stories of the last 15 years, and certainly of my generation. If you think about what's been going on, and let's start with natural gas, we've discovered something which is the equivalent of 2 Saudi Arabias of oil in the form of natural gas. We've had a tremendous amount of growth in tight oil production. And to give you some perspective, North Dakota as a state is projected by the end of the decade to produce the same amount of oil, if not more, that Kuwait and Norway produce individually. So that's tremendous amount of growth, and what's really stunning about it is not the fact, just the magnitude of how big it is, but how quickly it's happened. And any time when you have such a tremendous amount of change, that creates a tremendous amount of opportunity. And so I think we are seeing a complete renaissance in the overall energy landscape.
In terms of investment, what are some of the opportunities?
Well, shale tends to be very capital intensive. So if you think about the industry before the advent of shale, or at least before the commercialization of shale, it was a very different industry with a very different construct in terms of how capital was raised and deployed. When you think about the new environment that we're in, the average shale well can cost as much as 3 times to drill and complete as the old model. So there's a clear need for capital. And if you look at what we've discovered in terms of potential drilling areas, drilling sites, we have, by some estimates, something like 60,000 drilling locations. And if you look at some of the industry estimates around what it costs to drill that, it's about $200 billion of annual expenditures to develop those drilling locations. Give you some perspective, the industry as a whole on the public side generates about $90 billion of free cash flow, or operating cash flow before CapEx. So clearly there's a need for capital. We think the opportunities that come out of it are going to be around the whole value chain, all the way from upstream, which is drilling these wells, to midstream, developing the pipeline and the fractionation infrastructure, because today the producing hubs are no longer where the consuming hubs are. And so connecting those two will require money and will require expertise. And then finally, the logistics. We are one of the lowest cost providers and suppliers of natural gas and related products. So there's a whole boom that's happening in the chemicals industry. And we've also been quite active in exporting some of the associated LPG that comes from shale. And so we've made investments in essentially in LPG tankers that transport that from the U.S. to emerging markets where it's consumed.
Before you said it cost 3 times?
Yes.
Why 3 times? Where, what does it include?
Well, so if you think about the average well under conventional, you were spending about $2–3 million, maybe $5 million a well. These were wells that were generally less deep, and they were less complicated in terms of the fracturing stages. If you think about the average well, let's say in East Texas, North Louisiana, it's about 12,000 feet. So there's a lot more depth to it, and the complexity of the lateral length, where the drill bit turns horizontal and goes into the shale formation, just requires a lot more technology and labor.
Is that a whole different set of technology required, or you could build onto whatever you used before, but just to refine that?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
On the one hand, you are using a variation of the old technology. You're still drilling horizontally, and you're still going vertical before you go horizontal. But really, the main differences are you are drilling laterally. So the reservoirs, conventional, you would just drill straight down into it, and the oil would come up or the gas would come up. Here, you're going down maybe 10, 15,000 feet, 7,000 feet, depending on the formation. The drill bit then goes horizontal, and that was a big development in being able to drill horizontally. We're talking about miles here. And then the other thing was developing techniques around fractured stimulation. It's the so-called hydrofracking.
Yeah. Can you talk about fracking in layman's terms?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So fracking is really the process. So if you think about shale, it consists of sedimentary rock, which is really the source of the organic content that bubbles up and goes into the reservoir. So to extract organic content from the shale, you have to first break it apart. And the way that oil and gas companies do that is they send a drill bit down, they create, sort of the equivalent of what looks like a pipeline underground, except it's just a hole that's dug in the rock. And they send water, chemicals, and sand at a very high speed with a lot of pressure to fracture the rock, hence hydraulic fracturing.
And you said this whole, energy, it's such a not North American phenomenon. Is there any foreign players involved in this?
Well, in the first phase of shale, what you saw was a really significant amount of activity on the part of the more enterprising independents in the U.S., the mid-cap companies. And these companies really did a very aggressive job of buying up the acreage and doing what's, with the benefit of hindsight, been called a land grab. And once those positions were established, they needed money to develop them. And that's really where you saw a lot of foreign activity come in. We saw a great number of joint ventures in 2010, 2011, and 2012 by Asian partners looking to have that technology transfer. And we saw some activity by the European. Statoil was another active player, and BP was another one. Say Statoil and BP would be the two big European players that got into the market.
And for Asian, which countries are big?
Predominantly, it's been China. And obviously, there's two reasons for that. One is that China actually sits on something in the order of 1,000 trillion cubic feet equivalent of shale. It is believed to have more shale reserves than the U.S. Challenge, of course, is that the terrain in China and the accessibility to water is limited. The other main constraint is that you don't have the expertise on the ground, the service expertise, to successfully and commercially extract that shale. So that, coupled with the fact that China is obviously a big user of commodities, drives a real strategic interest on the part of China to be both an investor as well as a conduit for that technology transfer.
When you said you export to emerging market countries, China is among the list?
Yes, so what I was referring to is LPG. LPG is a little bit different than just gas, which is LNG to be exported. LPG is used predominantly in the emerging countries for cooking and heating. And so that's a market that's growing, in the mid-single digits. So what we do is essentially we provide a means of getting that cheap product offshore into those countries. And China is one of them, Brazil is one of them, India and Latin America are the bigger ones.
Currently, how they're not self-sufficient by any means, but they produce they could satisfy some of their own needs, right? Like LNG especially.
China is very dependent on foreign imports of LNG. Something like 2/3 of China's LNG actually comes from Qatar and Australia. I think over time, and maybe in the next decade or so, as China develops its own shale resources, and potentially if more pipelines are built joining China to Russian supply, that dependence could be diminished, but for the time being, nobody expects that to come down.
In terms of back at home, especially in the United States, people, especially people on Main Street, they are very concerned about environmentalism, social responsibility. How does that pressure or sentiment affects our investment decisions?
It's important. We try to be responsible corporate citizens, and we try to align ourselves with management teams that are not just good stewards of capital, but are good stewards for their communities. I think the invariable consequence of shale, and it's a big, industrial and manufacturing process, is there will be some externalities. So we recognize that any time humans are involved, whether it's flying an aircraft or drilling a well, there is the possibility of a crash or an accident. What we're, I think, a lot more focused on is implementing best practices, having a clear set of safety and health rules in place. And when you really think about what goes into shale drilling, the aquifer, which is where the water table is typically somewhere between 300 and 800 feet below the surface. The source rock, where the actual drilling occurs, can be as much as 7,000 or 10,000 feet below the surface. To give you a visual picture, it's roughly 17 statues of liberty stacked on top of each other between where the water is and where the shale chemicals, the fracking chemicals, if you will, are being dispersed. So where the accidents really happen is in the wellbore as the fluids are coming back up. And sometimes operators cut costs, and that's something that can be fixed with about several $100,000 of an investment, which in the grander scheme of things, when you think about these wells, they cost $5, $10, $15 million, is something that should and could be avoided.
Do you personally have any opinion on any of the ongoing regulations of the industry?
I think the industry is catching up. I think, as I said, there's been a tremendous amount of change in terms of how shale has affected the behavior of producers as well as capital markets who are investing in the development of shale. The regulation of the industry has some catching up to do. We think there will be more regulation. And I think, frankly, it's probably not a bad thing, provided that that regulation is transparent and consistent at the federal, state, and municipal level.
What do you think it's something that's missing but the industry needs immediately?
I would say, you know, first and foremost is ensuring that you don't have any kind of leaks into the water table.
Sure.
And we've all seen plenty of, you know, stories and documentaries about that. So I think that's something that captures the public's attention and is germane. And I think aside from that, it's just ensuring that there's consistency of process between the best players and others.
Okay. All right. Anything else you want to tell our viewers?
That's it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.